Hello and welcome. This is the third in a series of short stories written by James R. Curl. This yarn, called The Tower of the Serpent, was inspired by his favorite author, the late, great Robert E. Howard. I hope you enjoy it. The Tower of the Serpent. 1. The boy concentrated hard as beads of sweat glistened on his forehead and ran down the side of his face. Before him, suspended nearly motionless in midair, 3 large stones of jade sparkled in the golden rays of the early morning sun. Having kept them suspended for nearly half an hour, his tawny brown hair was damp with perspiration, and the dripping sweat was stinging his vibrant green eyes that gleamed with a youthful vitality. "Good, very good, Elmray," said Master Tarkan. Wearing a plain robe of brown cotton and low-strapped sandals, he was seated on the stump of a knotted and long-dead oak tree trunk. He was old, very old. A long, bone-white beard hung from his gaunt cheeks, and under bushy gray eyebrows a set of deep blue eyes regarded the boy approvingly. Even a dullard could see that those enigmatic eyes spoke of wisdom and knowledge that was unfathomable and inconceivable to the average person. There were those who said that Master Tarkan was once a mighty wizard who crossed the stars with the interdimensional being known as Ibon the Traveler. Together they traveled faster than light, visiting unknown worlds and consorting with strange and nameless things from other realms. And yet there were those who claimed he was just a hedge wizard, an eccentric crackpot, nothing more than an old prestidigitator who dabbled in simple tricks and sleights of hand to beguile the feeble-minded. As he watched the boy, a smile came to his lips, and the wrinkles around his eyes, of which there were many, deepened like the cracks in a sun-dried riverbed. The boy had manipulated the stones, and now they were stacked on top of each other, still hovering nearly motionless. It had been 6 years since Master Tarkan had taken in Elmray. The old wizard had found the child living on the streets, orphaned after his parents had died of plague and living hand-to-mouth as a thief and beggar. Tarkan had caught the boy trying to steal some of the supplies that he had purchased, but before he could grab him, the little thief had slipped away, laughing as he gave the old man a backwards glance. He was a filthy wretch, clad in stained and tattered clothing, but there was something about the boy that Tarkan had instantly recognized. Having lived for nearly 3 centuries, the old wizard was a good judge of people and could easily sense potential, especially when it came to innate magical inclinations that a person might possess. His curiosity piqued, Tarkan returned to the city a few days later and began searching for the boy. It took some doing, but the old wizard was eventually able to find the child. In an area on the outer fringes of the city, there stood several older buildings that had been abandoned for years. Little more than crumbling ruins, these dilapidated structures had long since been appropriated by beggars and homeless. It was here that Tarkan found the boy living in deplorable conditions among the dregs of society. Initially, the child was as suspicious as a trapped animal, and like a feral cat sought to escape. But after several visits and bribery with good food, he began to trust the kindly elder. It was shortly after that Elmray came to live at Tarkan's cottage, a small, cozy house built of gray stone, with a tall red brick chimney and neatly manicured front yard. After getting Elmray acclimated to his new home, he began teaching him to read and write and to properly care for himself. These lessons also included the learning and erudition of cantrips and simple spellcasting, simple at first. As Tarkan had suspected, Elmray proved to be highly intelligent and a willing and apt pupil. In fact, it was startling how fast he learned, and in no time Tarkan could see that he was the most exceptional apprentice he'd ever had. Tarkan was suddenly brought out of his daydream by the clatter of approaching horses. Looking up, he saw 3 mounted men on tall, wiry brown steeds, and a look of surprise came to his old eyes as he stood up abruptly. Elmray, losing his concentration upon hearing the approaching horses, could not maintain his hold on the jade stones. One by one they fell to the ground with a dull thud. Turning, the boy gazed upon the strangers. Two of the riders were of average height, but with the stout builds of fighting men. Both wore short, light gray cloaks that were open in the front and secured at the neck with silver chain that glinted dully. Under these they wore hauberks of gray chainmail armor, and both men were armed with longswords and shagreen scabbards. Their countenances were hard with sun-browned skin and smoldering dark eyes. One of the men bore a jagged scar that cut over the bridge of his hooked nose. The third man stood out in stark contrast to the other two. He wore no cloak or armor. Instead, he was outfitted in a long, dark blue robe fringed with intricate weavings of golden threadwork that was secured at the waist with a slim girdle of ivory-colored cloth. Staring wide-eyed, Elmray had never seen a man quite like him. He was tall, bald of pate and almost unnaturally thin, with dark-hued skin, a short blue-black beard, and a long hooked nose. His cheeks were hollowed and craggy, and his eyes were black, a glossy black that reminded Elmray of the eyes of a green serpent he had once seen when the traveling carnival came to town. And as Elmray stared at those eyes, he could see that they were full of threat and menace, and he was suddenly afraid. It was a fear that he had never experienced in his young life, a fear that gripped him with an icy hand, freezing the blood in his veins and causing his heart to pound fiercely in his chest. Looking away from the tall stranger, he glanced at his master, and there was no mistaking the look of consternation and fright that showed on the old man's face. Elmray had never seen such a look upon his master's countenance and was nonplussed at the sight. Climbing down from his great stallion, the tall stranger stood before them, his hands folded in his robe and a wry smile on his thin lips. "It has been a long time, Master Tarkin," said the tall man in a silky smooth voice as he bowed low. He then glanced at Elmray. "I see that you have a new apprentice," and his smile broadened as he regarded the boy. "What do you want, Yoza?" asked Tarkin. Yoza leveled his malevolent, cruel black eyes at Tarkin. "Is that any way to greet your former pupil?" he said in a cynical tone. "It has been a long time since last we met. Are you not at all interested in what I have been doing?" "Not in the least," replied the old wizard sharply. "Very well," said Yoza as he took a step toward Tarkin, and his baleful eyes blazed like coals of black fire. "But do not play me for a fool, old man," he hissed. "You know why I'm here. I want the Book of Eibon. For years I have searched for you. You were wise to stay hidden, but now I have found you, and I want the book." "I don't have it," replied Tarkin. "You lie," retorted Yoza, his eyes flashing with venomous anger. And quick as a serpent, he reached out and grabbed hold of Elmray with his long skeletal fingers, pulling the boy to him. From his robe he drew a long-bladed dagger and pressed the razor-sharp edge to the boy's throat. "Fetch for me Eibon's grimoire," said Yoza in a low, threatening voice, "or I will drench the very ground we stand on with this whelp's blood." Terrified, Elmray stood still, not daring to move, his fear-clouded eyes looking to his master. Tarkin was no fool. He knew well the evil that lurked within Yoza, and he knew that he would not hesitate to carry out his threat. "Very well," said Tarkin in defeat as his eyes met Elmray's. "I will give you the book." Tarkin then turned, and walking slightly hunched over and with a limp, he strode into his small gray stone house. A few tense moments passed, and presently Tarkin returned holding a large, thick book. It was evident by its antiquated design that it was very old. Its brown leather cover and thong bindings were cracked with age, and the brass clasp that secured it shut had long ago turned a dull green and was mottled with verdigris. Elmray had heard his master speak of Eibon's book, but had never seen it. From what he had gleaned, the book was a relic and was centuries old. In its time-yellow pages, it held a doctrine of cryptic and archaic secrets of other worlds, and vast knowledge of thaumaturgical lore and magic. the sorcerer Eibon had traversed the cosmos and had visited many worlds unnamed. And in that book he had documented the spells and instructions to unlock portals that opened into strange biospheres and realms unfathomable and unguessed by man. As Tarkin approached and made to hand the book to Yoza, there suddenly appeared in his right hand a long ash-colored staff of smooth, polished wood. And before Yoza could react, the old wizard uttered a word as he pointed the staff. Instantly, Yoza and Elmray were struck with an invisible force like that of a terrific wind that set them tumbling and sprawling across the grassy sward. The two mounted men leapt from their tall horses, drawing their long swords. But even as they landed on the ground, Tarkin pointed his staff, and a great burst of jagged blue light that crackled with raw energy struck both men full upon their chests. There was an instant of agonizing screams as they were engulfed in the searing heat of the blazing blue light. And then, laying upon the sward, were two smoldering corpses, blackened and blistered, and only vaguely resembling men. "You old fool!" came the roaring voice of Yoza. Having recovered from the unexpected attack, he was on his feet quickly, looming before Tarkin, his face a mask of rage. Tarkin shot a quick look at Elmray. "Run!" he shouted. Elmray, doing as he was told, ran to a cluster of trees where he stopped and hid himself. Tarkin then looked back at Yoza. "A fool I may be," he remarked, "but I would be a bigger fool to let you have Eibon's book." Yoza then leveled his gaze at Tarkin and bent his will at the old wizard. Like a physical force, it struck Tarkin, gripping him. Tarkin fought against that inexorable force of consciousness with his own will, and each stood immobile as statues, sweat starting from their faces, veins bulging bluely, and muscles quivering as their necromantic battle raged. "Your powers have grown weak, old man," said Yoza as he smiled grimly and his eyes blazed with a fierce light. Petrified with fear, all Elmray could do was watch as the terrible battle of mental willpower played out. And then there was a crack like that of a rotting tree branch breaking, and Tarkin's head was twisted around at an impossible angle, and the old wizard fell to the ground lifeless. Seeing his master fall, Elmray screamed and without conscious thought ran to Tarkin. Paying the boy no mind, Yoza bent down, retrieved the book of Eibon, and strode to his waiting steed. With tears streaming down his face, Elmray looked up at Yoza. His face was a mask of grief and anguish, but a lurid fire burned in those youthful green eyes. And as he met Yoza's evil gaze, he did not flinch. "I am going to kill you," Elmray declared with conviction. Yoza paused for a moment, and from atop his horse he regarded the boy, as if he were contemplating whether or not he should kill him. And then, with a wry smile, he spurred his steed and rode off quickly without a backwards glance. Elmray never knew how long he lay there sobbing, clutching his fallen master. It was the sound of an approaching horse that made him look up. With some relief, he recognized the familiar face of Bryn, a former student of Master Tarkin. Taking in the scene as he rode up, Bryn leapt from his horse before the animal had come to a complete stop and ran up to Elmray. "What has happened?" he said in a voice full of alarm as he gazed at Tarkin and then at the still smoldering corpses. "Men came," replied Elmray, wiping the tears from his eyes. "Who? Who were the men?" asked Bryn, giving the boy a serious look. "I do not know who the dead ones are," he said as he looked at the burnt corpses. "But Master Tarkin called the tall man Yoza." "Yoza!" exclaimed Bryn, and it was obvious by the startled look on his face that he recognized the name. "And why did Yoza come here? Did he say?" "He came for the book of Eibon," replied Elmray. "Master Tarkin would not give it to him, so they fought, and he killed Master Tarkin and left with the book." Bryn was silent for a moment, lost in contemplative thought. His normally kind and smiling face was troubled, and his warm brown eyes were fraught with concern. "This is indeed a sad day," he said finally, The death of Master Tarkan and the return of Yoza. "What are we to do?" asked Elmray, a look of anxiety showing plainly on his youthful face. Glancing at the boy, Bryn smiled weakly, trying to conceal the overwhelming sadness and perturbations he felt. "Fear not," he said. "We will give Master Tarkan a proper burial, and you will return to the city of Eisen with me." "Eisen?" said Elmray. "I have heard Master Tarkan speak of Eisen. He called it the City of Wizards." "That is right," said Bryn. "But why would we go there?" inquired the boy. "Because you must continue your training, and it is what Master Tarkan would have wanted." 2. The faint orange glow from a brass oil lamp illuminated a small, sparsely furnished room. Near a window there was a mahogany writing table and a matching chair with a high back. Placed on top of the table was a stack of dried parchment and a clay inkwell. Next to these was a cluster of goose-feather quill pens in a tin cup stained with ink. A few feet away stood a tall oak bookshelf, overpiled with yellowed scrolls and thick worm-eaten books. Several of the volumes were adorned with complex and abstruse symbols that ran along their spines. Adjacent to the table there was a single bed, and upon it Elmray lay slumbering, lost in a frightening nightmare. It had been 12 years since Master Tarkan's death, and only recently had Elmray returned from Eisen to take up residence in Tarkan's home. Since his return from the City of Wizards, Elmray had been plagued with strange dreams of serpents. Presently he found himself in a thick, swirling gray mist. In that haze swam emerald-green serpents with great wedge-shaped heads, glowing yellow eyes, and slitted black pupils. Through the churning miasma they slithered, seeking to entangle him in their crushing coils, or sink their venomous, dagger-like fangs into his flesh. With spells of fire and crackling bolts of searing electricity, he fought to keep them at bay. Yet for all his necromantic might, his spells were useless and they relentlessly encroached. Then one of the serpents drew back, its head poised to strike, its mouth agape and its great fangs dripping with venom. In that instant, the frightening scene abruptly changed. Instead of battling for his life, Elmray suddenly found himself in a room that had been hewn from solid rock. Its black walls and floor were smooth and gleamed dully. It was then that the young man realized he was no longer dreaming. And though the feeling was subtle, there was a difference now in his consciousness. He knew that his body remained slumbering back at Tarkan's cottage, but his soul was here. Looking about, Elmray could see the walls were carved with images of strange anthropomorphic creatures. Their bodies had the attributes of men, but their heads bore no human characteristics. They were disproportionately large, with wide flaring ears, small round eyes, and long curling tentacles where their mouths should have been. Staring at the bizarre figures, a shudder of awe rippled through the youthful wizard. What unknown hands had carved those cryptic images, and from what origins they came, he could not guess. At the center of the room, on a silver stand, a great blazing jewel radiated a soft white light that illuminated the chamber. Next to this stood a figure in a robe of earthen green. Pulling back the hood that covered its large head, Elmray stared in wide-eyed disbelief. Before him was a strange and fantastical being, with a dark green hide that was roughly textured. Much like the images on the stone walls, it had the body of a man with a massive head and large flaring ears. However, unlike the carvings, this creature did not have tentacles. Instead, it had a long proboscis-like trunk where its nose should have been, and from the sides grew ivory tusks that curved out like scimitars and were tipped with round golden balls. Its likeness bore an uncanny resemblance to an elephant, a creature that Elmray had seen illustrated in a book. From its huge head, eyes of golden topaz regarded Elmray, and as he gazed into those enigmatic eyes, he felt vast wisdom and knowledge as if they held the secrets of cosmic eons. In a stammering voice that never changed in key or tone, The creature spoke. "Elmray, apprentice of Tarkan, I am Yoga, and I have brought your consciousness here out of your dreams of serpents, here to the world of Yag." "My dreams," mused Elmray, "have been fraught with serpents ever since my return from Eisen. I know not why or what it means." "I know, and I feel," replied Yoga. "Those are the serpents of evil. They seek the rune staff of Eibon. They haunt your dreams, searching your mind for any hint of its whereabouts. For you are linked to Tarkan, and Tarkan is forevermore linked to Eibon the Traveler." Elmray had heard Master Tarkan tell of his friend Eibon. He had said that Eibon was a being that traveled the cosmos and was as old as the universe. He told of how Eibon came from a distant planet, so far away as to be almost incalculable. Elmray had also heard Tarkan speak of Eibon's mystical rune staff, but knew little of the strange artifact. He had read in musty books that it was imbued with great magical powers. Other writings claimed that the staff contained the essence of a sentient being, a god no less. "I know not where the staff is," replied Elmray. "But pray tell, why have you brought me here across the far expanse of space and time?" "O man of Earth, I have called you here because gigantic happenings are unfolding that could spell doom for your world. A blood-mad sorcerer has come into power, and he must be stopped. You know of whom I speak." Elmray's green eyes flashed with anger. "Yoza," he retorted angrily. "Of course, now it all makes sense." "So and so," said Yoga with a nod of his massive head. "But hearken well, O man. Yoza must never be allowed to wield Eibon's staff. In his hands it will become an instrument of destruction, and he will become nigh unstoppable." Yoga paused for a moment, his golden eyes studying Elmray. "I have seen, and I know," he said finally. "Since your birth I have watched you, for you are marked with great deeds yet to be realized. And you have grown in your sorcery, and powerful have you become." Yoga then closed his eyes as if in meditation and spoke in a sepulchral tone. "I know and I feel," he said. "Long have you yearned for vengeance for the death of your master, and now that time has come." Opening his topaz eyes, Yoga stared at Elmray. "You must take up the rune staff and put an end to Yoza's vile machinations." "Tell me," said Elmray, "where is the staff, and what must I do?" "Knowing that Yoza would search the stars for it, Eibon secreted his staff here on the world of Yag," replied Yoga. "Though Yoza suspects that it is here, he does not have the strength to wrest it. But he is growing in power, and the balance has tipped in his favor. Yoza has imprisoned Eibon in his great citadel. In time, he will learn the staff's whereabouts, and he will come, with all the might of his dark sorcery and his servants of evil." Yoga then held out his hand, and suddenly there appeared a long, slender staff. Much to Elmray's surprise, it looked to be wrought of metal, not wood as he expected. It was dull black in color, and covered in strange silver runes. At the tip fashioned into the metal was a great ruby that gleamed with a crimson radiance. "Take it," said Yoga as he held it out. Grasping the staff, Elmray glanced down at it. He was immediately inundated with a great rush of energy, as it seemed to be conveying all the powers and abilities it possessed. The wizard then became aware of a presence, an ego of sorts that seemed to communicate, not with speech, but with a will of its own. It was in that moment that Elmray realized the staff was indeed more than just magical. It was a living thing. Elmray was pulled out of his thoughts as Yoga once again spoke. Go now, man, back to your earthly abode, and make haste, for time is short." In an instant, Elmray was back in his room. For a moment he lay there wondering if it had all been a fantastic dream, but then he felt a movement at his side. Glancing down, he could see that in his right hand he grasped the rune staff. 3. Perched atop a low hill on the outskirts of the city of Isseron, Yoza's great citadel loomed. The pyramid-like structure was old, its origins stretching back into the dim gray past, when the first humans set hammer to chisel and carved out great cities of stone. For millennia the fortress sat in a pall of silence, shunned and unmolested by human hands. It was said that the place was cursed and guarded by demons and mighty spells. And then came Yoza. Heedless of guardians or ancient enchantments, he brazenly usurped the citadel, proclaiming himself its new ruler. All of this Elmray thought about as he gazed upon the citadel. Set against the backdrop of a starlit night, the ancient structure looked sinister. Nowhere could he see even a single light. All was dark. Gripping the rune staff, Elmray reached out with his consciousness. He could feel the staff's magic radiate through him, and in his mind he could see a shadowy figure in a dimly lit chamber. "I know exactly where he is," thought Elmray. And with a thought the young wizard suddenly vanished. Almost instantaneously, Elmray reappeared into a small room, lit by candles in a silver candelabra that sat upon a lacquered table. "You have come at last," said an unearthly voice that abruptly intruded into Elmray's mind. Surprised, Elmray wheeled about, raising his staff as he sought out the source of the voice. His eyes widened as they rested on a strange-looking being that he instinctively knew was Eibon. Near a wall, Eibon was suspended in mid-air, his arms and legs spread apart as if being held by invisible chains. Save for a form-fitting undergarment made of strange gray fabric, he was naked. In build he was like a man, but his skin shone silver in color, and he had no visible hair. His eyes were an ivory white and pupilless. Again the telepathic voice filled the wizard's mind. "Fear not, Elmray, I am Eibon." And as Elmray gazed at the otherworldly being, it was plain to see that he was in great pain. "Come closer, so that I may gaze upon you. Such is my suffering that all is dim before me." Elmray advanced a few steps until he stood before Eibon and looked into those ivory eyes. "You are as Tarkan said," and a weak smile came to his face. "Know that Tarkan loved you as a father loves a son." "I know," replied Elmray. "But what must I do to save you? I have brought your staff." "Ah, it is a wonder, is it not?" said Eibon as he glanced at the rune-covered staff. "But even its great magic cannot free me." He then let out a groan as his body was racked with torment, and his face contorted in anguish. A moment later, Eibon's voice returned to Elmray's mind, weak and strained. "Yoza has ensnared me with his dark enchantments. He tortures me, hoping I will break and give him secrets of the cosmos and the location of the staff. But all of this you know. Hearken now, Elmray. Yoza lies asleep, wrapped in sorcerous dreams of evil. He has expended much of his powers to imprison me. You must strike now while he is weakened, for even with the aid of the rune staff he will prove formidable." Eibon then went silent as his body once again writhed in the throes of violent torment. "You must know," he said, forcing himself to speak. "Yoza has learned much from my book and has traveled to many realms. His power has grown, and he has become more than human. You must slay him on this world, for if he escapes to the other, he will be too powerful, even with the aid of the staff." "Then I will slay that devil here and now," Elmray vowed with conviction. "But first there must be a way to free you. I cannot leave you in torment." "There is but one way," replied Eibon. "Take up the staff and pierce me through. Only death can release me now." Elmray was taken aback by Eibon's request. "I would never slay you. There must be another way," he insisted. "There is no other way. Yoza's cosmic sorcery is unbreakable, and should you die at the hands of that fiend, I must not be left here alive. He will take from me knowledge that he will use for vile purposes, knowledge that could change the very fabric of reality. Now quickly strike me down with the staff and free me of these earthly shackles, and worry not, for my life is not the life of man." Gripping the staff, it suddenly elongated to a sharp point. Gazing down at Elmray, Eibon's voice once again permeated through the wizard's mind. "Your path to Yoza has been made clear, and none will bar your way." He then shut his eyes. Setting his jaw, Elmray drove the staff deep into Eibon's body, and a strange clear ichor oozed from the wound as Eibon's head sagged to his chest and he died soundlessly. Turning away, Elmray strode from the room. Guided by Eibon's magic, he knew which way to go. He traversed long corridors lit with smoking oil lamps and ascended flights of stone stairs. Up and up he went, until presently he reached the topmost level of the citadel. Before the young wizard stretched a passageway that ended at a door of grey iron that stood open. Clutching the rune staff, Elmray strode to the door and boldly entered. He found himself in a large room that was richly furnished. The stone floors were covered in lush carpets, and from the walls hung decorative tapestries of velvet and gilded framed paintings of monstrous creatures. From a brass brazier atop a marble table incenses burned, their curling grey smoke filling the room with a sweet, pungent aroma. Elmray's eyes then went to the robed figure laying on a plush divan that he recognized as Yoza. As if sensing his presence, the sorcerer opened his eyes and rose quickly. "You!" he exclaimed. His eyes then widened in surprise as they gazed upon the staff that Elmray held. It had been 12 years since Elmray had last seen Yoza. The sorcerer looked even thinner than he remembered, as if the evil that he steeped himself in had somehow eaten away at him like a sickness. "Yoza," said Elmray in a loud voice, "you must answer for the wicked you have done." Yoza's mocking laughter was like the hiss of a serpent. "You, who are hardly more than an apprentice, dare to come here looking for vengeance? Bah!" he spat. "I will kill you as I killed Tarkan and take the staff from you." He then leveled his black eyes at Elmray, and the young wizard felt the inhuman power of Yoza's will. So great was that psionic blast that Elmray staggered back as if struck by a physical blow. For a moment he felt his consciousness being crushed and the limbs of his body twisting. But he was no weakling to be squashed like an insect. Gathering himself, he focused his mind and pushed back. Yoza's eyes showed surprise as he felt Elmray's mental power. For a moment the two stood immobile as stone statues, their faces masks of effort, as sweat started from their brows and their breath came quick. And then, inexorably, Yoza began to overpower Elmray, and the young wizard began to falter. It was then that Elmray felt the staff tug at his mind, and the Eldridge runes began to glow with a silver radiance. Gripping the staff until his knuckles went white, he felt power flow into him, lending him strength. And then it was Yoza who began to weaken, stepping back as his eyes grew like saucers with an impending fear. In his weakened state, Yoza realized that he could not defeat Elmray as long as he wielded the staff. Reaching into his robe, he brought forth a shining silver sphere that glistened weirdly. This he tossed into the air, where it hovered and began to spin rapidly. and as it spun, it started to glow with strange radiations and flashes of electricity. It was then that Yoza, having backed up to a wall, suddenly disappeared. Elmray could see that a section of the wall had swung open, and through this Yoza had gone. Elmray's attention then went back to the orb. It was spinning faster now, and shards of energy leapt out. Though not sure what it was, he muttered a word of power that instantly encased him in a shield of magical energy. A heartbeat later, the orb exploded in a great prismatic spray of purplish-blue electricity. Blinded by the brilliant flash, Elmray brought his arms up to shield his eyes. A few seconds later, all was silent. Dispelling his shield, Elmray could see that the room was in shambles. Tables were splintered, and the velvet divan, tapestries, and paintings were burnt and blackened. Stepping over spots where the carpet was smoldering, Elmray hurriedly crossed the room to the wall where Yoza had vanished. Groping around, he found a small depression that was all but invisible to casual observations. Pressing the spot, a portion of the wall suddenly swung inward, revealing a long dark corridor that hummed with a strange droning noise. With a thought, Elmray caused the ruby gem on the staff to blaze and fill the hallway with a lurid red glow. At the end, he could now see a door. With his staff raised, Elmray advanced warily into the passageway, and presently stood before the door. Ready for any lurking enemies that might be waiting, he cautiously pushed it open. Noiselessly, it swung inward, and he found himself peering into a curious room devoid of any furnishings. Its walls, floor, and ceiling were polished and gleamed as whitely as pure alabaster. Glancing about, he could see no source of light, yet through some kind of magic the chamber was illuminated. In the exact center of the room there were 2 cylindrical silver rods about 5 feet in height, 8 inches in diameter, and spaced approximately 4 feet apart. It was from these curious objects that the droning noise issued, and Elmray could see that they seemed to be vibrating rapidly. Years spent deep in the study of arcane magic, Elmray had become erudite of such things and recognized them for what they were. They were conductors used to open trans-cosmic doorways. He had read of such things and had seen illustrations drawn in ancient tombs. Moreover, he knew that the rods were forged from a rare telluric metal that was imbued with innate magical properties. With the use of certain spells, they could be made to resonate at particular frequencies. By varying the frequencies, different ecospheres, realms, and dimensions could be opened, giving one the ability to travel the cosmos at will. Standing before the doorway, Elmray hesitated. He had no way of knowing where it would take him, or what world he would step onto. Many of these cosmic ingresses led to strange, unimaginable realms and planets, some incalculably older than Earth and oftentimes inhabited by bizarre and hostile creatures. His thoughts then went back to Ibon's warning that Yoza would be too powerful to defeat if he were able to escape to another world. Setting aside his trepidation, the young sorcerer gripped his staff and with a deep breath stepped between the rods. As if he had simply passed through any ordinary door, Elmray immediately found himself outside. But it was a strange and outlandish world that he gazed upon. Before him was a vast flat plain with a wholly alien terrain. The ground of hard-packed dirt was the color of rust and strewn with jagged black rocks. The sky was a sickly yellow, with a swirling nebula of gray clouds that were occasionally lit up by jagged blue lightning. These bright flashes were followed by distant thunder that shook the ground. Among the gloomy miasma of clouds, the young wizard could see 2 rubious-glowing disks that looked to be suns, but they were far off, and the light and warmth they emitted was weak. To Elmray it seemed a lifeless world of desolation, and he was filled with a sense of oppressive brooding and menace. From where he had come through, Elmray noticed 2 metallic silver rods like the ones in the room he had just quit. And then his eyes fell on an ominous jade-colored tower with broad arched doors and a high castellated top. Sitting upon a rise just 100 yards away, it stood out in vivid contrast to its darksome surroundings. Gazing at the tower, Elmray knew that it was there that he would find Yoza. Clutching his staff tightly, he strode forward with a determined stride and a grim expression. Presently he came to a flight of broad steps that led to a set of huge iron-studded doors. Ascending the steps, he stood for a moment gazing at the tall building. He could see that it was made of a smooth green stone that gave the structure its distinctive jade color. Elmray then turned his attention to the iron doors. Hanging from massive bronze hinges, they were thick and heavy and looked to be nigh unbreakable. And as he stared at those foreboding doors, he held the rune staff in both hands. Concentrating hard, the ruby gem began to blaze with a crimson light, and there suddenly came a deep groan as metal slowly bent and the doors were pushed inward with terrific force. With a thunderous rending of iron and stone, they were savagely ripped from their hinges, as if struck with the might of a battering ram. As the doors crashed loudly across the stone floor, Elmray advanced into the tower. He found himself in a square chamber lit by a fire that roared from the brass brazier atop a tripod of wrought iron. The lurid orange flames leapt and crackled, casting dark and eerie shadows on the jade walls. Elmray's eyes were then drawn to a row of gray stone statues near a wall. These curious sculptures were of men and women in various postures of terror. So lifelike were the figures that an involuntary shudder shook Elmray, and his skin crawled with revulsion. To his left rose a spiraling staircase, its long thin railings fashioned into the likeness of intertwining serpents. At the top of the stairs was a high overhanging balcony. For a moment Elmray stood poised, pondering his next move as he gazed around the room. It was then that a familiar voice broke the relative silence. "You were a fool to come," said Yoza, his sonorous voice echoing throughout the chamber. "Here, on this world, I am omnipotent, and your staff will avail you not." Elmray glanced up at the balcony. At its railings Yoza suddenly appeared. Glaring down, his dark, hooded eyes regarded the young wizard with a baleful look from his black, bearded countenance. "I have learned all the secrets of Eibon's book," said Yoza. The sorcerer then tossed something from the balcony that landed heavily on the stone floor. Elmray could see that it was Eibon's grimoire. Slowly, Yoza descended the twisting stairs, and as he did, he spoke. "And from that book I learned how to move between worlds. I came here to unlock the lost secrets of the Tower of the Serpent. This tower was brought here millennia ago by the great necromancer Otif Ogrim. Over time, I have unlocked its dark mysteries, and in doing so, I have become more than a mortal man, far more. With the power I have gained, I will conquer worlds. And now only one thing remains." Yoza's dark eyes fell to the staff Elmray held. "I need the rune staff," he said. "And like a fool you have brought it here. In a moment I will wrench it from your dead fingers. And now you will see all that I have become." Yoza then unclasped his long crimson robe, letting it fall to the floor. And as it fell, a startling and rapid transmutation took place. The sorcerer's body began to elongate and thicken, tearing through clothing. His face stretched, and his dark eyes turned yellow with slitted black pupils. His long bony arms merged with his body, and his dusky skin faded to be replaced with glistening green scales. Elmray, gazing in mute disbelief, was unable to react as fear gripped him with its paralyzing hand. Before him reared a great emerald-green serpent with diamond-shaped patterns running along its back as black as anthracite coal, an 80-foot monstrosity born from nightmares and madness. Its massive head towering over Elmray swayed hypnotically, and as his eyes met those of the serpent's, he felt the evil of that reptilian gaze. It was an ancient evil that went back to time immemorial, when the first creatures crawled and slithered on their bellies, and the earth was a stinking morass of steaming lava and sweltering jungles where reptiles ruled supreme. For a fleeting moment, Elmray stood senseless, caught in the spell of those hypnotic eyes. And then he felt the staff tug on his consciousness, as if it were pulling him back from across an endless black void. In that moment, the image of Master Tarkan flashed through his mind, and Elmray remembered. Anger twisted his face as he broke free of the serpent's gaze. And as he did so, he yelled his hatred loudly and raised the staff. Its runes suddenly blazed a bright silver, and from the ruby gem burst a deadly beam of silver light. With blinding speed, the serpent moved to avoid the blast, but for all its agility, the beam still struck. Though the reptile had avoided the brunt of the blast, there was a blackened and blistered spot that wafted smoke and reeked of burnt flesh. This, however, only seemed to madden the reptile. Its great wedge-shaped head reared up, and its yellow eyes flashed wickedly as its thick coils whipped towards Elmray. With a desperate leap, the young wizard tried to avoid those deadly coils and again bring his staff into play. But no human could match the speed of those reptilian snares. In an instant, the coils had looped about Elmray, trapping him in their crushing embrace. The serpent leveled its head with Elmray's, and its long black tongue darted out lightly, brushing his face. And slowly it reared back and up into striking position, its mouth opened, and dagger-like fangs dripping a yellow poison that was certain death. Helpless in those inescapable coils, Elmray could do nothing. He knew in another instant those fangs would sink deep into his flesh, and the poison would course through his veins like liquid hellfire. And just as the great head came down like a stroke of green lightning, there was a flash of intense silver light. This was followed by a terrific impact that caused that deadly bite to pass Elmray by a hair's breadth, and the jaws to clamp shut on empty air. Looking in disbelief, Elmray could see the familiar figure of Eibon, his arms wrapped around the serpent's thick neck, pulling it back. In its wrath, the reptile thrashed and writhed savagely, and Elmray was hurled violently from its coils to land bruised and battered upon the hard stone floor. With an effort, he stood up, swaying unsteadily. Every muscle in his body ached as he gulped great breaths of air. Eibon's telepathic voice suddenly filled Elmray's dazed brain. "Take up the staff!" Elmray could see that despite the serpent's best efforts, Eibon still clung tenaciously to its neck, but for how long could he hold that mountainous might of fury and muscles at bay? Looking about frantically, Elmray spotted the staff. Having been torn from his hands as he was thrown from the serpent's coils, it rested several yards away. Hurriedly, he raced across the chamber, snatching the staff from the floor. Wheeling, he saw Eibon pulling the serpent up, exposing its underside. And without a conscious thought, he knew what to do. Peering down at the staff, he thought of a spear. Suddenly, the staff elongated, and at its tip formed a broad silver spearhead. In one smooth motion, Elmray drew the staff back and released it with all of his might. Like an arrow it sped, striking the serpent and sinking deep into its scaly green folds. In agony, the monster thrashed in the throes of death. Its huge coils, flailing whip-like, struck the tower's walls with an impact that reverberated loudly through the chamber. A moment later, the great serpent was still. "It is done," said Eibon as he approached Elmray. "I thought you dead," said Elmray, still surprised by Eibon's unexpected appearance. "My death is not like the death of men," he replied. "Like the multiverse, I have lived and died many times over." And then, as they stood watching, a transfiguration took place. The serpent began to change and morph, and a moment later it was Yoza that lay on the floor, his dark, lifeless eyes staring blankly. Grabbing hold of the staff, Elmray wrenched it from Yoza's body, and then retrieved Eibon's book from where it lay on the floor. Turning to Eibon, Elmray made to give the items back. "No," he said, "they are now yours. It is up to you to master the mysteries of the book and the staff. My need for them has passed, and I am off for other worlds, for now," he said cryptically. He then paused and gave Elmray a meaningful look, and his voice resonated in Elmray's mind. "There will always be another Yoza," he said, "and your world will always need one such as you to ensure that the coils of the Serpent never gain a hold." Eibon then rose into the air. "You have been marked well, Elmray, apprentice of Tarkan, and mighty happenings await you." And with a silvery flash, Eibon the Traveler was gone in an instant. For a time Elmray stood, musing over all that Eibon had said. Grasping the rune staff and book, he then turned, and without a backward glance strode away from the Temple of the Serpent. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed The Tower of the Serpent, please hit the like button and subscribe so you know when the next story is released.